Hello and welcome to the Africa Fashion Podcast. On this research podcast series, we're sharing insights and expertise on the fascinating world of African fashion. You'll be hearing from academics and industry experts and learning about the opportunities and innovations that they see in African fashion and in the work of African designers. My name is Dr. Lauren England and I'm a lecturer in creative economies at King's College London.
And my name is Dr. Eka Ikpe. I'm the director of the African Leadership Centre at King's College London.
And we will be your podcast hosts for this episode. We've been working together with our colleague Roberta Communion, who's a professor in creative economies, researching African fashion and creative economy development in Africa since 2019. This podcast series is supported by the African Leadership Centre, the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, and a Global Engagement Partnership Fund from King's College London. This episode is a conversation with Ken Kweku Nimo. Ken is a designer, brand strategist, researcher and author of the book Africa in Fashion. He's based in Ghana, but has also worked in South Africa. In this podcast, we'll be talking about Ken's experience as a brand strategist, his research on African luxury fashion brands, and also his journey writing the book Africa in Fashion. We'll be going deeper into the idea of luxury and drawing out also some connections between his work and the research that Eka and I have been carrying out with our colleague Roberta on this idea of lead firms in the African fashion industry. To start off with, I'd just like to say thank you and welcome, Ken, to the Africa Fashion Podcast. We're really delighted to have you as a guest on the podcast and thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate being here.
Amazing. So I think Eka is going to start us off with some questions.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Ken. I'm going to start off with a conversation about your own journey to where you are today. And let me begin by asking, how did you come to research African luxury and fashion brands?
My journey as a researcher was unplanned. I left Ghana sometime in 2016 for South Africa to study. And I had the intention of going to study to be a fashion designer. And this was after a decade of operating and running my own business, a creative business in Ghana, and just getting bored and saying, look, I wanted to actually get on a bigger challenge. I applied and enrolled on a 1-year honors degree in fashion. Unknown to me, it was a research degree. I had no idea. I just wanted to go in as quick as possible and come back spend a year in South Africa and come back. And I signed up for a research degree. But upon commencing the program, I was quite intrigued. And as I delved into the research in fashion, during my honors mini dissertation, my focus was on the operational challenges of South African luxury brands. This further sort of entrenched my interest in researching African fashion, which informed my decision to study towards a master's degree at the University of Johannesburg soon after my honors degree. And so that's how my journey began. It was quite unplanned, but ultimately I discovered a niche that I felt was really important. Of course, Africa does not lack in creative designers and in a lot of wonderful designers. What I felt was lacking was a voice and the lack of research, especially as while I did my research, I noticed a lot of the things that I wanted to learn about were not in the textbooks. African fashion was explored as either from the ethnographic dimension or as cultural studies, but not as business. And that is also what I sought to achieve with my book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Now, how would you say your research connects with your work as a brand strategist?
They are almost inseparable. As someone that works closely with brands, quite a number of brands in both in South Africa, West Africa, I have to have a finger on the pulse of the industry. I have to always be in close sync with what is happening on virtually every front of the industry. And this is what informs how I engage with the designers and with the brands that I work with. It's also symbiotic in a way, because I also gain and obtain a lot of feedback and a lot of insight from these brands that I engage with, from these brands that I work with, that in a vice versa way sort of also shapes my understanding and my appreciation, and of course my outputs on African fashion.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is very intriguing how you present that, and the work that many of us as researchers try and hope to do in terms of how we engage with the communities that we work with in our research, or the communities that we actually research, how to build and to establish a symbiotic relationship like that. So thanks very much for sharing that. Let me come now to the output. You have the book Africa in Fashion. Can you say a little more about that book, about the project, a bit about the motivation? I know you already reflected on wanting to see certain materials already available during your own studies, and that was one factor. But if you can tell us a little more about what motivated this project, that would be great.
Yes, African fashion was, as I said in the beginning, the result of my curious inquiry into the operational challenges. It started off as an investigation into the operational challenges of South African luxury brands. Upon engaging a number of distinguished designers in South Africa, I was literally hooked on further engagement even after I had presented my mini dissertation. I literally embarked on an independent research after my honors, did a few travels. I would travel to Cape Town when it was Africa Fashion International Week, where there was a number of designers from all across the continent congregating, and I will engage them. And at a point in time, I had an incredible wealth of data, research data, audio recordings and interviews, and a deeper reflection it just dawned on me that this is information that I believe the world should have. This is insight that I believe should be put out there in a properly curated, in a properly presented structure. And that immediately got me working and reaching out to publishers, agents, and trying as much as possible to put this work out there. Like I also mentioned earlier, I have that objective of approaching and addressing the topic from a business perspective. Of course, I do explore African fashion history. I do explore the trajectory of the evolution of fashion in Africa. And I sort of like center it around the business side of fashion on the continent. And that I believe is one of the things that sort of distinguishes this work from that of other books and other resources on African fashion. But more importantly, I sought to sort of present the works of these designers and to use them or to project them as benchmark, and if I should say, as a blueprint that other emerging designers and creatives could aspire to or could model their projects or their works after. And so all of these, and I believe quite a number of other things, did motivate the publication of this book in its form and entirety.
Thank you again. Really rich response there. Something that's come out, looking at the book, you see, I saw a very broad range of coverage in terms of designers across the continent. So I'm interested in idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea of, who are African designers. How did that influence, who we see in the volume? And associated with that, I'm keen to know, what was that collaboration with these designers?
That's an interesting question. I think the notion and the notion of Africanness is somewhat challenged in how I present it or the outlay of this book. So I will use, for example, it was not necessarily confined to designers who were based or working on the continent. I do explore the works of designers who are outside the continent in the diaspora. Also, it is not confined to the works of ethnic Africans in terms of race. I do explore the works of designers who are not Black in that sense. And so I believe that the notion of Africanness is in a way challenged. What I did, and I believe I succeeded in sort of projecting, was the conversation around value chain and the emphasis being on the operations of these designers being Africa-centric, either Africa-centric in a tangible product value chain, as in being sourced, produced, sold, and marketed on the continent, or intangible in terms of cultural influence. So, for example, designers like T. Michael, who, for example, makes kimonos that would be somewhat disconnected, but to a large degree actually emanates from his connection to his ancestry or to his heritage as an African, and actually explains the connection of his heritage to his expression as an artist and as a designer, and how he's even able to reinterpret the Japanese kimono. And so this I think is what I think the book sort of succeeded in pulling off, in sort of widening the scope or expanding. In terms of working with the designers, that was quite a tall one. It was quite difficult, but I would say one of the most challenging, but also fulfilling, because the breadth of design, if I should say, practice and design ethos and specializations, and balancing from fashion, from conventional fashion design to accessories to, it was all quite an interesting learning curve. I would say a lot of the designers that find it really resourceful, engaging with me, perhaps because of my connection to the industry and my interest in the industry. As I said before, I already had my own business as a designer in Ghana before I ventured into, and even while in South Africa, while I studied in South Africa, I did have a semblance of a design practice. I had a studio in Melville, in Johannesburg. And so to some degree, I could empathize and connect to a lot of the challenges that these designers and these creators face. And so when we're having a conversation, it was almost as though a peer-to-peer conversation. And it could easily lead me into areas that ordinarily would be sort of like sealed off.
Amazing. We can really see how like your business experience is like then interacting with your research experience, and maybe also how the two are informing each other as you go on. It's a very like symbiotic relationship. I'm going to sort of come in here is also hearing you sort of articulate how you were approaching this idea of African fashion as a very kind of like open and kind of an encompassing category. Yes. That enables you to also work with and showcase such a range of designers both on and off the continent, and playing with that idea of like heritage and what it means to be working in Africa in design, but also being an African designer and how that interacts with each other, I think is something that we've been also trying to kind of unpack a little with our research, and something we're keen to do further. I wondered if there, in relation to that, what the idea of luxury means to you in that space. If you're looking at this very kind of open and diverse concept of African fashion design, how does luxury play into that?
On the conversation of luxury, of course, it's a conundrum of a word. It's very tricky to define and confine, but within the context of African fashion, I would start with like a fundamental, like a point of, let's say, departure of Africa from the conventions of the global north, with the exception of South Africa, that, for example, has a semblance of an integrated value chain when it comes to fashion. The rest of Africa has very little in terms of taxonomy when it comes to distinguishing what is like mass manufactured products to what's a designer wear to what's a luxury brand. There is actually a confliction. So, for example, what is luxury in the West? To have a custom-made apparel by a designer is the ultimate luxury. It's priceless. I mean, like, very few people can actually afford that. It is the other way around here on the continent, where it is actually more accessible to have a designer custom make your garment for you, and might rather be more expensive and pricier to walk into a department store or into a mall to buy a luxury item from a mall. And so these conversations make it a bit tricky. However, I believe that luxury, of course, is subjective, but it is determined by social, cultural, and economic factors. That is just an important aspect of this conversation, defining what luxury means in Africa, or defining what it means for something to be classified or categorized as luxury. How did I go about defining my brand as luxury? First of all, the designers themselves or the brands themselves had to deliberately or consciously position as luxury. So that was, for me, the starting point. The designer did not associate or position as luxury, then I believe that, of course, that is not a conscious in itself. You cannot ascribe something to somebody that does not consciously associate or connect to a specific concept. So that was a first. And then I also looked at their approach to production and the structure of their operations. So basically, were they sourcing locally? Were they incorporating handcrafting techniques or the handmade? Were they also positioning and branding themselves for the target market? Mind you, these are brands that, as I have said earlier, identified or positioned as luxury. And so within their practice and their operational practice, I could determine who I would go to in my pursuit to engage designers that were positioned as luxury. We understand that within marketing, as Kafera and Bastien will put it, luxury is a strategy. I mean, like within the concept of marketing, within the concept of retail, luxury is a strategy. But in Africa, the boundary between luxury as a strategy, as a marketing strategy, and luxury as a tangible part of the operations of brands is blurred. And that, of course, itself presents quite a number of challenges. Of course, these are designers that don't have the resources in terms of the financial investments, like to project and to position as global designers or brands in global north would position as luxury, but are indeed perceived also not just by themselves, but also by consumers as luxuries.
I'm really fascinated by this idea that, you can flip this idea of what is a luxury garment on its head in a different context. And then thinking about also then where you would be sourcing that as a consumer, your own perception of luxury, where you would be going to consume luxury could look very different in very different spaces. But also that slight tension, I think, maybe in the way the designers you've worked with may be positioning themselves as luxury, but having very different operational and kind of business experiences in that searching to develop a luxury brand. Something I think that potentially quite unique experience, or that location specific experience, I think is something that, as you've mentioned, there's so little known about that at the moment, but there's so much more to explore in that space. So it makes it a really fascinating, obviously quite a challenging environment, but also potentially, and this is something I think we've been trying to kind of think through, is the opportunities for learning from that space. For example, in environments where you've got resource scarcity, or you've got challenging in accessing particular materials or supplies and resources, or you've got challenging economic environments, shifting social and kind of political and economic kind of systems, what you can learn from people's response and adaptation to that can actually be really valuable outside of the continent, if we're thinking about kind of global systems and the challenges that people might be facing. So I think it sounds like there's like a million more things that we could speak about. And I wanted to also to connect also, because I know you've written a paper, an article on consumer-based brand equity in South Africa. Is it for fashion brands specifically, that paper, or are you also looking at a diverse range of luxury brands in that context?
The focus of this research was consumer-centric. And so to some degree, I would say it was a follow-up to my previous research, which was supply centric. So I had previously engaged with the designers to understand the operational environment, challenges within the operational environment for my honors degree. And I thought I shared that with you. I will share that with you as well. It's quite an interesting piece. This was basically a follow-up. So I had already engaged the designers on the supply side. My interest was now, what do consumers also have to say about these brands? And so it's sort of like a balancing act. And so this was actually consumer centric. I used a list of brands. So there was a part of the questionnaire that used a list of brands, a list of known design luxury brands in South Africa as examples that this consumers would refer to. But I also still opened up the opportunity for example, to say in a designer other than what's in the list, and respondents would provide names of designers. For example, I think I did not include, I'm not sure if I included Thebe Magugu back then, and this was in 2019. He was yet to actually emerge. It was later in 2019 that he won a number of awards, including the LVMH prize. But I noticed that some respondents put his name in. About 3 or 4 respondents actually put in Thebe Magugu, and I was like, that's interesting. And so that's basically it was consumer centric, if I should say that well, and so simplify.
That's really interesting to think also what that might be indicating about kind of like upcoming designers and who's getting noticed in the market. That sounds fascinating. I know in that paper you note like this relevance of like hedonism and like pleasure seeking and also behavioral loyalty in terms of that consumer behavior. Could you unpack, for us and also for listeners of the podcast, how is that particularly relevant maybe to the South African context or to the luxury brand space for other emerging economies, and what we might learn from that specific kind of consumer behavior?
Basically sort of applied ACRE's consumer-based brand equity to examine the disposition of consumers to South African luxury brands. And this was perhaps the first in terms of the study and the approach in South Africa. And I sought to understand brand loyalty by examining consumer brand awareness, by examining all these precepts that basically make up the consumer-based brand equity model by ACRE, including brand association, brand awareness, and brand equity, basically in its totality. I discovered from the research that there were, for example, as you mentioned earlier, hedonic value being one of the most important determinant factors of why consumers, would buy into a specific brand. Hitherto, the idea, the concept had been a lot of the research on South African luxury consumers had sort of used this whole concept of logomania, the fact that they felt that consumers were attracted to logos more than the substantive brands themselves. And earlier research had, so for example, which had even led to sometimes, if I should use a term, like mischievous marketing and branding by predatory global brands, international brands that came in, and because a lot of these consumers sort of like were more attracted to the name. And this has actually had been studied by a professor at the University of Johannesburg called Stila. And she had done this research to the extent that there were brands that were not considered luxury in Europe, but had positioned that way in South Africa. And by virtue of being popular or being very widely known, had leveraged that to sell as luxury. But what my research did was to actually point to the fact that it didn't really discredit that, but it also helped us appreciate that there was more to the concept of luxury consumption in South Africa than the logo, than the brand, and that consumers indulged in hedonism or indulged in pleasure-seeking, activities. And to some degree, I sort of connect this to a lot of factors, including South Africa's formal, if I should say, status as a segregated, like what you call it, country, and the apartheid, where, for example, there's a conversation around a segment of the luxury consumers in South Africa called Black Diamonds, and these Black Diamonds basically refers to the middle class, an emerging middle class, actually the established middle class of wealthy Black Africans who ample resources and are able to engage in discretionary consumption as much as the white counterparts in South Africa will. And you'd see them in your certain cities, you see them in your Hyde Parks, you see them in all the major luxury retail spots. And it's an interesting conversation, but I use this to examine, could this pleasure-seeking something that could be explored even a bit further? What is the real motivation? Is it just a signal of people just sort of rewarding themselves for achieving something in life or achieving things in life? Or is it revenge consumption? Is it like there could be so much to it in the context of South Africa and its multiracial consumer market? And that's that I think, like you said earlier, I think that opens up, there's just multi-dimensions exploring and understanding this phenomenon of luxury in South Africa.
Absolutely. I think you've set out a whole research career ahead of you. You will never run out of an amazing research topic, I think, at this rate. I think it's amazing you've considered obviously the designer's perspective and also then the consumer perspective. But I guess we're coming back to that sort of that brand and the designer focus. And I'm thinking, like, it's in relation to what you then know about the consumer behavior. There are things that brands can do to leverage that, to know that their consumers are doing this in, for a hedonic kind of principles and how they can then tap into that. So I think that really speaks then to this idea of the kind of resources and strategies that brands and designers can adopt, which definitely connects to the research that we've been doing on this idea of lead firms in African fashion and trying to unpack that further. So I'm going to hand back over to my wonderful co-host Eka, who's going to give us a little bit of a sort of a short intro and sort of what our research has been looking at, to then explore how what you've been saying about your work and the designers that you've worked with, how that connects with some of these ideas.
Great. Thank you so much. It's fascinating just listening to all of that and digesting it. So great to build on that and move to this next set of conversations. Now, as we've hinted at through this set of conversations, we've been carrying out some research on rethinking the idea of lead firms that draws from the literature and global value chains and global production network. And these firms that sit atop and sort of accumulate the majority of the value within value chains or within production networks as well. I mean, the idea there is, they also drive and lead innovation. They're in charge of brand management, own brands themselves, in charge of sales and distribution, for instance, but may utilize the services of others for, activities that are noted as lower value, such as manufacturing or actually making. And this is especially prevalent in conversations about garment production on the African continent. But we move away from those conversations on garment production to situate fashion designers as lead firms, where we recognize these fashion design firms, fashion producers is a broader term we've been exploring around this as well. We see them as really sitting at the top of these value chains, driving decisions around branding, around sales and distribution, and then innovating as well in terms of design. So really thinking about original design, having a market, they have having brand followership as well. So very much linking to some of those points you've already been making, these conversations between designers and their consumers. And it's, we think it's an important intervention because the literature that engages ideas around lead firms almost always situates lead firms as being located outside, in terms of geographies of lead firms, if you like, as being located outside of Africa, and seeing the firms engage in lower value activities, cut, make and trim and that sort of things, as being based on the African continent. And it seems like a huge challenge to actually break out of that sort of framing. And we think that, and also based on some of what you're saying, I think you're even more convinced that we can think of fashion designers as leaders in these ways, as those that are actually holding and capturing value in particular ways. And the work we've done, we've been looking at designers in Lagos and in Nairobi, where we've identified lead firm characteristics across these categories of design, of inputs, production, marketing, sales, and distribution as well. And the lead firms from below framework that we are developing and exploring, we're arguing that, this allows us to think also about the intersections between the role of the state, the role of government, in sort of strengthening the capacities of such lead firms, especially when we think of how they might be engaging with consumers domestically, so in the national markets, but also in the continental markets and also internationally and globally. And I think your work really reflects on these different layers of markets as well. So we're saying if we recognize the sort of hierarchies within the global economy that, has actually situated producers, designers that based on the continent, in particular parts of this hierarchy in the global economy. States, government policies have a very distinct role to play in trying to disrupt some of those hierarchies as well. So that's, some background on some of what we've been exploring and thinking about. And we, in looking at your book, African Fashion, and some of the designers you profiled there, there's really a sense that it actually illustrates this presence of lead firms in the fashion design space in relation to Africa. I know we've problematized how we think about African fashion in this way. So I'm quite keen to get from you a sense of this sort of intersection. I mean, we see it. Do you? And if you see it, how do you see it? And if you don't, also, what underpins that sort of perspective?
I do see that sort of like, first of all, there's a point that I sort of like I note down here, and I'll probably just want to read it. So basically, in the absence of supportive infrastructure in the face of uncountable challenges, as you allude to in the article, it takes unfathomable resilience and exceptional creativity and entrepreneurial spirit for African brands to emerge as global competitors. This is within the context of basically sort of placing side by side these lead firms or these lead designers from below and sort of like pitching them against their counterparts in the global north, where there is ample infrastructure, resources, funds. For example, within luxury, there is the Alta Gamma, there is the Craft Council, there's these institutions, both private and public, that have the mandate to sort of like to help and to sort of to support the development both of designers, both as economic agents and as cultural agents, which is almost non-existent. When you come to Africa, to be specific, it is the other way around, where the policy interventions are almost always targeted at mass manufacturing. That is, if there's any policy intervention targeting the textile and apparel industry, it sort of like skips the creative fashion design sector and targets mass manufacturing at the expense. I would use, for example, the textile industry and within the global value chain of luxury, the strength of any economy or the strength of any location is reliant almost on its unique competitive advantage. For example, if that location is supposed to be a part of the chain, the global value chain of luxury, where does Africa has its competitive advantage? Look at the textile industry, the indigenous textile industry. And yet that niche industry, which is primarily made up of Maskant, craft people, small community, craft communities, women, and a wide variety of disconnected, let's say, hotspots of crafts, are not the target of these policies. These policies tend to target mass manufacturing, for example, Ankara, or mass printing of textiles like so-called African print. The competitive advantage is watered down. For example, Kente. I always say that whenever I had the opportunity to speak about Kente, I say Ghana should have an institute of textile research dedicated to Kente alone, because Kente could be has the potential to be a game changer in global luxury. You saw Kente showcased on the Louis Vuitton menswear by Virgil Abloh, and you see that instead of this attention or this sort of like focus being on these designers, it is almost non-existent. However, we've seen that with the right conditions and with the right frameworks, this sector has incredible potential. You look at the work of the WTO's, there is this project by the WTO called the Ethical Fashion Initiative, which is led by Simeon Ciprani, and you see how he's able to connect these hotspots of craft communities and artisans to global brands like your Stella McCartney, like your Gucci, like these big brands, and yet we still have not succeeded in actually establishing a framework that adequately taps into this potential. And so yes, there is a connection, and also at the point there's also there's also a disjuncture, and like we always keep coming back to, I believe that this conversation literally opens a floodgate of incredible multidisciplinary, multi-dimensional research on virtually everything, from designers, from intellectual property in the conversation around designers as brokers of culture, of cultural, like agents, to production, to it's just mind blowing. It's just mind blowing.
Thank you so much for that. I think very rich exchange. On this really significant point, if I may, just take a little bit of that, and perhaps Lauren, if that's fine with you, I see this as a sort of place to bring this. In this conversation about, and I hear you, the connections and disconnections and all that, but thinking of, African fashion producers, designers, all of this as, being at the pinnacle of some forms of innovation, the sort of designs they offer, the sort of, a lot that's being said about sustainability, for instance, and, the fashion world is in crisis. In general, and I think there is in the work we've been doing here, and in on this particular project, but other papers we're engaged in, the lessons from these actors, some of those you've engaged with, that could change actually narratives of fashion more widely. So thinking of African innovation and how that can shift the way we address and engage these issues on the global platforms. Any insights from you around that?
So in my book, I explore, and I sort of like call it just a preamble. I explore the concept of Lux Ubuntu, and within this Lux Ubuntu concept, this was developed by Martin Leke, who happened to have a brand, a tea brand called Yasuara, and within the concept of Lux Ubuntu, an approach basically that sort of applies African traditional concepts of community and ethics in production, or basically approach to life, African philosophy, African cultural philosophy as basically as a framework that would potentially assist in the reset of global fashion or global luxury. And I would use, for example, in the tradition of the Akan, for example, a wood carver, or let's say like a wood carver who makes, let's say, furniture or makes stools or make what we call asesegwa. Asesegwa is a traditional stool. Before even cutting down the tree from which he would hewn that, furniture, piece of furniture, will propitiate, would pray to the gods and will propitiate the gods before he would even advance to take from nature. So basically, there is an approach to taking a considered approach to even extracting from nature. Within this very concept of revering or of understanding and appreciating our connection to nature, because it knows if somebody had this considered approach to taking from nature, they would be more cautious of producing, of production. This person would, of course, not go into the forest and just wantonly cut all the trees, because he knows that his very existence is connected to the tree and how he treats the source of his own livelihood. In that way, there is sustainability embedded in how he relates with environment. And this is just one piece of the conversation around Lux Ubuntu, our relationship with environment and how we take from the environment. Once we have this as a philosophy, that feeds into the creative models, or if I should say frameworks of designers, of creatives. We have found a part of the solution, because we have to understand that one of the biggest issues at the heart of unsustainability is production practices. People being basically careless about how we take from the earth or how we take from the earth. I know I have met designers who had made the conscious decision to source locally and to have an oversight on the complete value chain, because they could attest, as against somebody that would say, for the bottom line's sake, I would go to China and I could not care less how it's made. It just has to be made and I make my profit. But this is where African designers become interesting case studies or models for study. I'll use another example. Akusia Friye Kumi, who happens to have a brand called AAKS, sources all her production, the entire value chain, basically locally in Ghana. She works with women in the northern region. She's based in Kumasi, works with women, weavers in the northern region. All the dyeing process, everything happens in under her purview, and and she's very transparent about it. She's also worked with UNHCR on a project that sort of empowers women who are fleeing conflicts from Darfur and other parts of Africa. But you'd see how she also incorporates. You also have to understand that within the production scope of production also exists a level of responsibility for the cultural narrative that sort of moves from ideation to production. We are, by extension, custodians in how we sort of incorporate and how we sort of engage with culture, with cultural norms, with cultural practices. For example, even the production process itself is different. Even in Ghana, how women produce in the northern region where Akosia sources is different. And she tells me, I have to have a much more empathizing mode or approach of engaging these artisans, because they do have cultural practices and cultural norms that are different from mine that I need to accommodate. So there's certain hours they cannot produce. There's certain periods of times they cannot produce. There are certain days that they cannot produce. And she has to incorporate and work around all of these. And all of these are connected to our heritage, to our culture. And as custodians, there's a responsibility to make sure that all of this is protected. And so there's quite an interesting conversation when it comes to sustainability. And of course, once you know that you have to be cautious with taking out, you're not producing dead stock that's going to end up discounted. It informs it. And this is just one dimension of what I explore as Lux Ubuntu in the book. There are a couple of other dimensions. And I believe that African designers, leaders, actually, they are unconsciously operating. Some of them, of course, are doing so consciously, but quite a number of others are unconsciously engaging in models that are worthy of emulation from designers and production infrastructures around the world.
Thank you so very much. I think that is a very powerful reflection there. I drew from it also what you said about being custodians. So these are knowledges, these are, this is knowledge creation, and how we hold on to that, how we document that, how we share that. Then, I'm struck by all of those questions. And when I say document, again, think of the range of ways in which one documents, or as researchers in the academy, is like, how do I write a paper about that? But not everything is about writing a paper about that. It's really very significant, very powerful knowledge that also resets in our minds how we even think of African spaces as sources of knowledge, innovation, spaces we can learn from. I think we don't hear enough of that. So very, very grateful to you for sort of shining the light on that work. Thank you.
It's just so rich listening to that discussion, and I think loads of connections with the work that we've been sort of trying to sort of frame these ideas of where innovation is coming from, and like that, as you were saying, that source of inspiration and models for emulation around the world, particularly in this area of sustainability, which is another area that I'm particularly interested in, and that we've been exploring. This idea of like what does sustainability look like? What are ideas like the circular economy look like on the continent, and how is that relationship with the global market? How does that work? Where are the tensions there? Where are the opportunities to do that reimagining and potentially quite a radical rethinking of different ways of operating and building a fashion economy where there are opportunities for domestic markets to take a different approach, to say, no, we're not going to adopt that exploitative, damaging environmental model, but also having that real intrinsic connection to the social as well. And I think that's something that we see perhaps more here than elsewhere, is that you said with the Luxembuntu, there's both an environmental consideration of being a custodian of the earth and of the resources that you use, but having that desire to support local communities, to support women and sort of in skills training and in employment opportunities. That I think is something that we've seen particularly prominent in the work that we've seen, and in the examples that you've shared in the work in the book. That really comes through as that desire to have local supply chains, to have local employment opportunities built into the business model for these designers. So I think that's also something really exciting to explore as an opportunity to think about how more ethical, sustainable, and kind of socially just kind of business models could be developed for fashion, which I think is one of a particularly pressing issue for everybody.
So, by the way, the book there's a German co-edition of African fashion, and I am extremely pleased that it happens to be one of the very few volumes exploring African fashion. I believe that it's going to make a difference in some way. I am also at the moment working on an online course on the modern history of African fashion, which I plan launching sometime later part of this month. And so that's basically what I have been up to. But yes, I'm excited about this conversation and everywhere that it leads. I am more than happy and excited to contribute at any point in time that you need me on board. And I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sounds like you're keeping very busy. We'd love to hear how your course, the online course development goes. That sounds really exciting. And absolutely, I think there's so much that we could follow up on. And
absolutely, yeah. I'll just add my thanks as well. Absolute pleasure, and lots of threads there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast with Ken Kweku Nimo, myself, Lauren England, and Dr. Eka Ikpe. We are fascinated to hear about Ken's research and his work in strategy, and also in exploring some really exciting connections with our own work on lead firms and ideas around sustainability. If you'd like to find out more about Ken's work, please check the show notes on the website. You can find links to his book, his publications, and the work that he's got coming up. We hope you'll join us again for another episode of the Africa Fashion Podcast. Thanks for listening.